Hi everybody, hope you're doing well today. So in this video, we're going to continue our quick crash course in logic, and we're going to introduce some deductive standards for evaluating arguments. So in this video, we're going to briefly review what an argument is, then we'll talk about two aspects of an argument that you can evaluate: the content of the argument and the logic or structure. Then we'll talk about two standards you can use for trying to evaluate arguments: deductive standards and inductive standards. But most of the video is going to be introducing what these deductive standards are, and the two critical ideas here will be the notion of validity and that of soundness. So remember the technical definition of an argument that philosophers are working with. An argument is a series of statements, some of which supposedly provide support for one of the others. There's those two components. It has to be a series of statements, and some of those, the premises, have to supposedly provide support for some of the others, for one of the others, the conclusion. Now, in evaluating arguments, obviously the first step is just to make sure that an argument is being made. After you've done so, you need to identify what the premises are and what the conclusion is. Once you've done that, once you understand what the argument is, you can then try to determine whether the argument is good or bad. However, it's important to distinguish two aspects of arguments that we can evaluate, since arguments can be good in some ways and bad in others. So two important aspects here are the argument's content, which has to do with the information given in the premises and conclusion. Now, obviously, an argument with good content will be one where the information it gives is true. But we also want to look at the argument's logic or structure, because an argument's logic or structure focuses on the connection or relationship between the premises and the conclusion. We want premises to offer genuine support to the conclusion. Because remember, the definition of an argument is one where the premises supposedly or aim to or try to give support to the conclusion. But premises might try to support the conclusion, but fail to. All right, so we want a good argument to have good logic where its premises really do support the conclusion. So there might be a good connection or relationship between the premises, so there might be good logic even if everything the argument says is false. That'd be a case where you have an argument with good logic but bad content. Similarly, there might be a bad connection or relationship between the premises and conclusion, even if everything the argument says happens to be true. That would be a case where an argument has good content but bad logic. In a sense, you might believe the right things, but you might believe them for the wrong reasons. So just to clarify a little bit, I'm going to give you some examples to hopefully let this really hit home. Consider the argument that says, well, Dr. Samuel Taylor lives in San Francisco, and San Francisco is in California. Therefore, Dr. Samuel Taylor lives in California. The information contained in premise 1 is false. Nonetheless, the logic of the argument, the reasoning from those premises to the conclusion, is flawless. So this is an example of an argument where the logic is fine, but the content is bad. On the other side here, though, consider the argument that says, premise 1, Dr. Taylor lives in Alabama, and Auburn is in Alabama. Therefore, Dr. Samuel Taylor lives in Auburn. Now, in this argument, the content is actually perfect. So all of the information contained in this argument is true. I do live in Alabama, Auburn is in Alabama, and I do live in Auburn. The problem is that despite those premises and conclusion being true, reasoning from those premises to the conclusion is problematic, since those premises don't offer genuine support to the conclusion. That conclusion doesn't follow from those premises. If someone were to believe that conclusion on the basis of those premises, they would believe the right thing, but they would believe it for the wrong reasons. All right, so we want arguments that are good in both ways. We want arguments that have good information, but we also want the logic or reasoning to be good as well. When we look at the logic, there's two standards that we might use to try to evaluate arguments and whether they support their conclusions. First are deductive standards. Second, there are inductive standards. So deductive standards are the ones we use when an argument's premises aim in some way to guarantee the conclusion's truth. But sometimes arguments' premises will aim to do something less than that. Inductive standards are those that we use when an argument's premises aim to make the conclusion probably true without trying to provide a guarantee. All right, now we're going to start by focusing on deductive standards since induction gets a little bit more complicated. We'll look at that a bit later. An argument that has good logic by deductive standards is one that is valid. So this word, however, has a very specific meaning in philosophy. A valid argument is one where it's impossible for all its premises to be true while the conclusion is false at the same time. Notice this doesn't say that it's impossible for the premises to be true, and it doesn't say that it's impossible for the conclusion to be false. It just says it's impossible to have both those things happen at the very same time. Another way of saying the exact same thing in slightly different words is a valid argument is one where if all its premises were true, then its conclusion would have to be true as well. Yet again, notice that this definition doesn't say the premises are true. It just says a valid argument is one where if its premises were true, then the conclusion would be guaranteed. So an invalid argument then is just one where it's possible for all the premises to be true while the conclusion is false. Here's an important point that this is the number one thing that causes confusion among students. Validity is not the same thing as truth. To say that an argument is valid is not to say anything about whether its premises are true or whether its conclusion is true. It's to say something about the relationship between premises and conclusion. So premises and conclusion can be true or false, but it's nonsense to say that a premise or conclusion is valid or invalid. Similarly, arguments can be valid or invalid. They can have the right relationship between their premises and conclusion. However, it doesn't make any sense to say that an argument is true or false. So as our reading explains then, there's a three-step process that you need to follow to figure out whether an argument's valid or invalid. We might call this the imagination test of validity. First, you need to identify the argument's premises and conclusion. Second, you need to imagine that all the premises are true even if you know that they're false. Because yet again, we don't want to know, are the premises true? We want to know, well, if they were true, would they guarantee the conclusion? So we imagine that they're all true, and then we ask, can we also imagine that the conclusion is false? If we can, then the argument's invalid, because that will show that it's possible for the premises to be true while the conclusion false. If we can't do this, then the argument is valid, since imagining the premises being true would guarantee that the conclusion would be true as well. All right, so let's consider some examples. Consider the following argument. If Jane's passport is expired, then she's not allowed to travel out of the country. Jane's passport is expired, therefore Jane is not allowed to travel out of the country. Is this argument valid? The answer is yes. Now notice, you don't know who Jane is. I mean, is her passport expired? I don't know. She's just someone I made up. But the idea is, in order to assess the validity, we say, well, the first premise tells us that if her passport's expired, then she's not allowed out of the country. Let's just assume that that's true. And let's also assume that the second premise is true, that her passport is expired. Well, the idea is, if we imagine that both those claims are true, well, then it would have to be true that Jane is not allowed to travel out of the country. All right, let's consider another example. Premise 1. If your philosophy professor's name is Samuel, then his name starts with an S. Your philosophy professor's name starts with an S, therefore your philosophy professor's name is Samuel. Is this argument valid? No, it is not. Yet again, we imagine that premise 1 is true. We imagine that if your professor's name is Samuel, then his name starts with S. That's pretty easy to do since you spell Samuel with an S. And also, let's imagine that your philosophy professor's name starts with an S. We can simultaneously, though, imagine that the conclusion is false. That is, imagine that my name is Steve. Well, if my name was Steve, then premise 1 would still be true, and premise 2 would still be true. But if my name was Steve, the conclusion would be false. And so that shows that those premises, even if they were true, they would not guarantee the conclusion. And so the argument is not valid. Or let's consider another example. All alligators have tails made of gold. Your philosophy professor is an alligator. Therefore, your philosophy professor has a tail made of gold. Is this argument valid? Yes, it is. So, if we imagine that the premises are true, and again, I know that alligators don't have tails made of gold, and I know that I'm not an alligator. But nonetheless, if those premises were true, then the conclusion would have to be true as well. So validity is important because we want our reasoning to be logically correct. We don't just want the things to be true, we also want the reasoning to be good. And valid arguments are the ones that have good reasoning. Valid arguments are also guaranteed to preserve truth. If we put true premises into a valid argument, we always get a true conclusion. Invalid arguments are not guaranteed to preserve truth. So even if we put true premises into an invalid argument, we might not get a true conclusion out of it. An invalid argument might have a sort of true conclusion. However, if the argument's invalid, the premises or reasons don't prove that conclusion. The conclusion, if it turns out to be true in an invalid argument, it's just true as a matter of luck. So if you believe the truth of a sort of invalid argument, you are, yet again, you might end up believing the right thing, but believing it for bad reasons. Now, a valid argument also cannot have true premises and a false conclusion. And so if you know that an argument is valid and you know that its conclusion is false, then you thereby know that at least one of its premises has to be false as well, even if you originally thought they were true. And so noticing the validity of an argument and noticing that its conclusion is false might help you identify mistakes you've made, since you know that not all of its premises can be true. All right, so valid arguments are guaranteed to preserve truth. However, if any of the premises are false, then there's no truth to preserve. Then the conclusion of the valid argument isn't guaranteed to be true. So because of that, we want arguments with both good logic and good content. On deductive standards, we'll call this a sound argument. So a sound argument is an argument where it is both valid and all its premises are actually true. So consider the following argument that we saw before. Is this argument sound? No. As we said before, it is valid since its conclusion follows from its premises, but it's not sound because, well, premise 1 and 2 are false. Well, what about this argument that we saw earlier? Is this argument sound? And again, the answer is no. All the premises are true, but what makes this unsound is the fact that it's invalid. So the first step for determining whether an argument is sound is to determine whether it's valid. If an argument is invalid, like the last one, then it is also unsound. If the argument is valid, like the alligator's argument, then it might be sound or it might be unsound. You need to further determine whether its premises are true. In the case of the alligator argument, they weren't, and so it was unsound. So how do you decide whether the premises are true? Well, determining the truth of a premise isn't a matter solely of logic. It requires us to appeal to our knowledge of various subject matters. So the things you learn in history, psychology, environmental science, you can use this background information to try to assess whether the premises are true. But then you're going to need to use logic to determine the validity. If you're unsure, you can try to determine whether the premise is true by creating new arguments for or against the premise that appeals to other information that you know. And if you do all of that, you might still be unsure whether the premise is true even after you've considered arguments for and against that premise. And so if your original argument is valid and you can't decide whether the premises are true, well, then you might be unsure whether the argument is sound or unsound. All right, so that's all for this video. Our next video is going to discuss some argument forms that are common that may thereby help us identify some arguments as valid or invalid without using that imagination test. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.